"You have 15 minutes," my husband shouted. "My family is hungry." Then his hand struck my face. The sound seemed louder than the pain. For a second, nobody at the dining table moved. His mother stared at me. His sister lowered her eyes. His brother-in-law suddenly became very interested in the glass of iced tea in front of him. I touched my cheek and looked at David. Then I said something that made all four of them laugh. "Okay," I whispered. "Give me 15 minutes. What they didn't know was that I had already spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this dinner. And when I came back from the kitchen, I wasn't carrying just food. I was carrying 4 envelopes that were about to change everything. My name is Rachel Carter, and until that night I had spent 11 years believing that being a good wife meant being patient. Patient when David came home late. Patient when his contracting business had a bad month. Patient when his mother called me selfish because I wanted one quiet Saturday morning. Patient when his sister needed help with her car payment. And especially patient when David told me, "You're better with money, Rachel. Just cover this for now." For years I believed for now meant temporary. I was wrong. That evening I had worked nearly 12 hours at the medical billing office where I had been employed for almost a decade. We were short-staffed and I had agreed to stay late because I knew David had been complaining about money again. I sat in my car at 9:32 p.m., rubbing my tired eyes and wondering whether there was any point in cooking. My back hurt, my feet were swollen, and I had eaten half a granola bar around 4. Still I drove home. That was what I did. I came home. I solved problems. I kept the peace. When I opened our front door at exactly 10:03, I could hear voices coming from the dining room. I paused. David had company. His mother Linda was there. So was his younger sister Megan and Megan's husband Kyle. Nobody had told me they were coming. I stepped into the dining room wearing my work blouse and black slacks. David looked at the clock. Then he looked at me. "Where have you been?" I blinked. "Working. You said you'd be home earlier. I told you this morning that I was staying late." He pushed his chair backward. "My family has been waiting for dinner." I stared at the table. There were 4 empty plates. 4 people had been sitting there expecting me to serve them. I almost laughed. Instead I said, "David, I just worked almost 12 hours. His jaw tightened. And his mother sighed dramatically. "Rachel, honey, we're all hungry." I looked at her. "Then why didn't anyone order takeout?" That was when David stood up. "Because you're my wife." The room went silent. He stepped closer. "You knew my family was coming. You should have had dinner ready." "I didn't know." "Yes, you did. No, David. I didn't." His face changed. Not sadness, not disappointment. Anger. "You always have an excuse." I took 1 step backward. "Please don't start this tonight." He pointed toward the kitchen. "Go cook." I didn't move. "David, go cook." His voice shook the room. Then his hand came across my face. I heard the slap before I felt it. My head turned to the side. For a moment I could hear nothing but a faint ringing in my ears. Nobody stood up. Nobody said, "Are you okay?" Linda simply whispered, "Oh, David." Not because he had hurt me, because she was worried about what might happen next. I looked at each of them, and something inside me went strangely quiet. I had imagined this moment many times without realizing it. Not the slap, the clarity afterward. I finally understood that I wasn't standing in a difficult marriage. I was standing inside a system that depended on me staying silent. I looked directly at David. Then I said, "Give me 15 minutes." He smirked. Finally. I walked into the kitchen. I closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to breathe. On the counter were the groceries I had bought that morning. I pulled out the chicken, vegetables, and potatoes. I began cooking. Not because David had ordered me to. Because I wanted the next 15 minutes to be calm. I needed them. As the oven warmed, I opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. Behind an old casserole dish was a small black folder. I took it down. Inside were copies of bank statements, loan documents, emails, and photographs of paperwork I had never signed. I had collected them quietly for 3 weeks. At first I thought David was simply bad with money. Then I discovered the withdrawals, then the transfers, then the signatures, my signature. Except I hadn't signed those documents. I had already spoken with a financial advisor. I had already scheduled a meeting with an attorney. And earlier that afternoon, while David thought I was working overtime, I had received one final message from the attorney. "Rachel, the house may be at risk. Bring everything you have." I read that message again in my mind. Then I looked toward the dining room. I could hear David laughing with his family. They sounded relaxed, confident. They had no idea what I knew. I took 4 envelopes from the folder. On the first, I wrote David's name. On the second, Linda. The third was for Megan and Kyle. The fourth contained documents about our house. I placed them beside the plates. Then I returned to the stove. 15 minutes later, I carried dinner into the dining room. David looked pleased. "See," he said. "That wasn't so hard." I said nothing. I placed the food on the table. Then I sat down. David reached for his fork. I slid the first envelope toward him. "Before anyone eats," I said quietly, "there's something you need to read." David looked at the envelope. Then at me. "What is this?" I held his gaze. The reason I was late. And for the first time that night, nobody at that table was hungry anymore. The envelope sat in front of David like a warning nobody had bothered to write in red. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked at me. "What's this supposed to be?" I folded my hands in my lap. "Open it." His mother shifted in her chair. "Rachel, whatever this is, couldn't it wait until tomorrow?" I turned toward her. "No, Linda, it couldn't." That was the first time I had ever interrupted her without apologizing afterward. David noticed. His expression hardened. He picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside were copies of our joint bank statements. He glanced at the first page, then the second, then the third. His face changed. "What the hell is this, you tell me?" He looked at the others. Megan leaned forward. "What are those?" David didn't answer. I did. "They're records of money transferred out of our accounts over the last 8 months. Kyle stopped chewing. Linda frowned. "Rachel, this is a family dinner." "No," I said quietly. "It was supposed to be. I had learned something during those 3 weeks of investigation. People often imagine financial betrayal begins with one enormous theft. It usually doesn't. It begins with small things. A transfer here, a credit card charge there, a business expense that doesn't quite make sense, a signature that looks familiar enough to escape suspicion, a spouse saying, "Don't worry about it." That was how it happened with David. For 11 years I had trusted him. When we bought our house in Ohio, we combined our finances because that was what married couples around us seemed to do. We had separate spending accounts, but the mortgage, utilities, insurance, and savings came from our joint account. I handled most of the household budgeting. David handled his contracting business. It seemed reasonable, until last spring. That was when David started telling me business was slow. He said construction costs were rising. He said customers were delaying payments. He said several jobs had gone over budget. I believed him. So when he asked me to work overtime, I didn't question it. "I just need us to get through the next few months," he told me. I nodded. "We will." He kissed my forehead. "You're the best, Rachel." I believed that too. Then strange things started happening. Our savings balance kept dropping, even though my paycheck hadn't changed. I asked David about it. He always had an explanation: insurance, materials, a tax payment, a temporary cash flow problem. Then, one Saturday morning, I was sitting at our kitchen table paying the electric bill when I noticed a transfer for $8,500. It had gone to an account I didn't recognize. I called David. He answered on the third ring. What's this transfer?" There was a pause. "Which one?" I read him the date and amount. "Oh, that's for the business." "What business account?" "My new operating account." "You never told me about a new account." "Because I didn't think it mattered." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't think it mattered. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But something had changed, so I started looking. Not obsessively, not dramatically. I simply began keeping copies. I downloaded statements. I photographed documents. I checked our credit report. And then I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a home equity line of credit connected to our house. I had never applied for it. I called the bank the next morning. The woman on the phone verified my information. Then she said something I will never forget. "Ma'am, the application shows your signature." I sat in my car outside the grocery store staring through the windshield. "That's impossible." "I understand." "I didn't sign that." She became more careful. "Then I strongly recommend you speak with an attorney." That was the moment I stopped asking whether David was making bad financial decisions. I started asking whether he had been deceiving me. I contacted a financial advisor first, then an attorney. I didn't tell David, not yet. My attorney reviewed the documents and asked me a simple question. "Did you authorize any of these transfers?" "No." "Did you sign these loan documents?" "No." "Then don't confront him until we understand the full picture." So I waited. And while I waited, I discovered more. Money had gone to David's business. Money had gone to his mother. Money had been used to pay a credit card belonging to his sister. There were even payments connected to a vehicle I had never seen. I felt sick. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing how many people knew. Because when I showed my advisor the transactions, she noticed something I hadn't. The transfers weren't random, they followed a pattern. David had been moving money from our household accounts whenever his business needed cash, and some of that money was eventually distributed to members of his family. I remembered all those dinners when Linda complained about her medical bills, all those times Megan said she was just barely getting by, all those conversations where David told me his family was struggling. I had believed we were helping them. We weren't helping. I was financing them. The final piece came 3 days before that dinner. My attorney called. "Rachel, I found something else." "What?" "There are documents suggesting your husband may have used your financial information as part of the business financing." I closed my eyes. "Can he lose the house?" "It's complicated, but you need to protect yourself immediately." I asked the question I had been avoiding. "What happens if I leave?" There was silence. Then she said, "You need to make decisions based on your safety and your legal interests, not his promises." That afternoon I opened a bank account in my own name. I changed my passwords. I secured copies of every important document. And I wrote down every questionable transaction I could find. Not because I wanted revenge, because I needed the truth. By the time I arrived home that night, I had already made my decision. I would not scream. I would not threaten him. I would not hit him back. I would simply stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. That was why when David slapped me, I didn't lose control. In a strange way, he had done the one thing that made pretending impossible. Now we were sitting at the table with the first envelope between us. David finally looked up. "This doesn't prove anything." I almost smiled. "No," I reached for the second envelope. "It doesn't." Then I placed it in front of Linda. "But this might." Her face went pale, and for the first time I saw fear in the eyes of the woman who had spent years telling me I wasn't doing enough for her family. Linda stared at the envelope in front of her as if it might explode. "What is that?" she asked. I kept my voice calm. "You should open it." She looked at David. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. That tiny movement told me everything I needed to know. Linda noticed it too. Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were copies of bank statements showing several transfers from our joint account into an account connected to David's business. But there was more. I had highlighted 3 payments. The first had gone toward Linda's medical bills. The second had paid off a credit card. The third had been transferred directly into an account in Linda's name. She stared at the pages. "I don't understand." "You do," I said. David pushed his chair back. "Rachel, stop." I looked at him. "No." His face tightened. "You're making a scene." I almost laughed. "A scene?" I touched my cheek gently. "You made the scene when you hit me." Nobody spoke. The silence was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of people waiting for dinner. It was the silence of people realizing the person they had underestimated was no longer willing to play along. Megan reached for the documents. "Mom?" Linda pulled them away. "Don't." Megan looked at me. Rachel, where did you get these from our bank? David interrupted. She went through my private business records. Our money isn't your private money. He stood. I didn't move. For years, that would have frightened me. That night, it didn't. Maybe because I finally understood something about fear. Fear becomes smaller when you stop negotiating with it. David pointed toward the hallway. Go upstairs. I looked at him. No. His mouth opened, then closed. He wasn't used to hearing that word from me. I picked up another envelope. This one is for Megan and Kyle. Megan immediately shook her head. No, I don't want anything. You should. I slid it across the table. She hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of payments made from David's business account toward their credit card. Megan looked at Kyle. Kyle looked down. How much I asked. Neither answered. I did. $14,600. Linda covered her mouth. Megan's eyes filled with tears. David told us it was a business loan. I turned toward my husband. Was it? He rubbed his forehead. It was complicated. No, I said. It wasn't. I reached for the folder beside me. It was money from our household. David's voice became defensive. I was going to pay it back. You've been saying that for months. I needed to keep the business alive. And you decided I didn't deserve to know. He looked at me. You wouldn't have understood. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it revealed exactly how he saw me. I had spent 11 years helping him build a life. But when the important decisions came, apparently I wasn't intelligent enough to be included. I leaned back in my chair. You're right about one thing. David looked at me. I don't understand. His expression softened slightly. What I don't understand how you could look me in the eyes every morning and lie to me. His face fell. Nobody said anything. Then Linda suddenly started crying. David, what have you done? He turned toward her. Mom, I was trying to help everyone. No, I said. You were trying to control everyone. He slammed his hand against the table. You don't know what it's like to have people depending on you. I stared at him. I know exactly what it's like. I looked around the table. I've been the person everyone depended on. The room became quiet again. I told them about the overtime, about the bills, about the mortgage, about every time I had postponed something I needed because someone else needed money first. I told them about the vacation I canceled because David said the business needed cash. I told them about the dental work I delayed. I told them about the weekends I spent catching up on household paperwork while everyone else enjoyed themselves. I wasn't listing these things to make them feel guilty. I was finally saying them out loud. David looked away. His mother wiped her eyes. Megan whispered, I didn't know. I know. She looked at me. If I had known, you would have asked different questions. She nodded. That was the first honest thing anyone had said all evening. Then I placed the final envelope on the table. David stared at it. What is that? I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow breath. This is about the house. His face changed instantly. He reached for it. I pulled it back. Wait. He looked at me. I want everyone to understand something. I pointed toward the envelope. This isn't a threat. Then I looked directly at David. And it isn't revenge. His expression hardened. Then what is it? Protection? I opened the envelope myself. Inside were copies of documents from my attorney. There were notices regarding the questionable debt. There were records showing that I had formally disputed transactions I had never authorized. And there was a letter explaining the steps being taken to protect my ownership interest in the house. David stared at the papers. You hired a lawyer? Yes. When 3 weeks ago? His voice dropped. You planned all this? No, I looked at him. I investigated what you had already done. That distinction mattered. David sank back into his chair. For the first time that night he looked tired. Not angry, not powerful, just tired. Linda whispered, Is the house safe? I looked at her. For now. David's eyes widened. What does that mean? It means you don't get to gamble with our home anymore. He picked up the documents. His hands were shaking. I watched him read. Then he stopped at one page. His face went pale. "What?" I asked. He looked at me. "You actually filed this, yes." His chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "You had no right," I answered quietly. "I had every right to protect myself." He looked toward his family. Nobody defended him. Not even his mother. For the first time, David understood that the balance of power at that table had changed. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to threaten him. I had something much stronger. The truth. Then his eyes filled with tears. "Rachel..." I waited. His voice cracked. "Please." I said nothing. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Don't leave me." And somehow those 4 words hurt more than the slap. Because for 11 years I had been begging him not to leave me emotionally. He had simply never noticed. "Please don't leave me." David's words hung in the room. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the sound of his hand against my face. I remembered the months of lies. I remembered the money. And I remembered how many times I had asked him gently whether everything was okay. He had looked me in the eyes every single time and said yes. I lowered my voice. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet." David took a shaky breath. "So you're staying?" "No." His eyes closed. I said I haven't decided. Linda began crying again. Megan sat completely still. Kyle finally pushed his plate away. Nobody was eating anymore. The dinner I had spent 15 minutes preparing had become something none of them could swallow. David looked down at the documents. "Rachel, I can explain. You already did. I mean everything. You told me the business was struggling. It was. You told me the money was temporary. It was supposed to be. You told me your family needed help. They did." I shook my head. "That doesn't explain the signatures." David went silent. I watched his face. That was the question he couldn't answer. The money could be explained. The bad decisions could be explained. Even the lies could be explained, but my signature couldn't. Not unless he admitted what he had done. Finally, he whispered, "I thought you would refuse." I stared at him. "Refuse what?" "The loan. So you signed for me." He didn't answer. "You used my name." His eyes dropped. That was enough. I stood up. Linda looked at me. "Rachel..." I raised my hand. "Please don't." My voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. "I don't want another argument tonight." I gathered the documents. David suddenly reached for my wrist. I stepped back immediately. He froze. I saw the realization on his face. He remembered. So did I. He released his hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I nodded once. "Good." Then I walked toward the hallway. "Where are you going? To a hotel? You're leaving tonight?" "Yes." He stood. "Please, Rachel." I turned around. "You had 11 years to ask me to stay." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." "No," I said softly. "I don't think you do." I went upstairs. I packed one suitcase. Not everything. Just enough for a few days. Work clothes, toiletries, my laptop, my medication, a pair of comfortable shoes, and the small framed photograph of my father that sat on my nightstand. As I zipped the suitcase, I heard David downstairs talking to his mother. His voice was low. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard one sentence clearly. I didn't think she'd actually do anything. I stopped. That sentence told me more than all the documents. He had never believed I would leave. He had never believed I would investigate. He had never believed I would protect myself. He had confused my patience with weakness. When I came downstairs, everyone looked at me. David stood near the front door. "I'll call you tomorrow." I shook my head. "No," his face fell. "My attorney will contact you." He swallowed. "Rachel, I mean it." I opened the door. Then I heard Linda behind me. "Can I talk to you?" I looked back. She was standing alone now. The confidence she usually carried was gone. She looked like an older woman who had suddenly realized she might have made some terrible choices. What she lowered her eyes. "I didn't know he had used your signature." I believed her, at least partly. "But you knew about the money." She nodded. "Yes." Why? She wiped her cheek. Because I was afraid of losing my house. I stared at her. She continued. David told me he could help me if I kept quiet. I took a slow breath. And you thought that was okay? No, her voice broke. I just didn't know how to stop it. I looked at her for several seconds. Then I said, You should have told me. I know, that was all. No dramatic speech, no excuse. Just 2 words. I nodded and walked outside. The cool night air hit my face. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I drove to a small hotel about 20 minutes away. In the parking lot, I turned off the engine and sat there. My cheek still hurt, but the deeper pain was somewhere else. It was in the realization that I had spent years trying to earn love from people who believed my usefulness was the same thing as my worth. I went upstairs. I showered. Then I called my attorney. I left the house. Are you safe? Yes. Good. Don't go back alone. I won't. There was a pause. Then she said, Rachel, you did the right thing by documenting everything. I looked out the hotel window. I don't feel strong. You don't have to feel strong. What do I have to feel safe? That word stayed with me. Safe. Not happy, not victorious, not powerful, safe. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds I didn't remember where I was. Then everything came back. The slap, the envelopes, the house, the signatures. I reached for my phone. There were 14 missed calls, 9 from David, 3 from Linda, 2 from Megan. I didn't answer any of them. Instead I went to work. I sat at my desk and processed insurance claims while my personal life seemed to be collapsing around me. At lunch, I checked my email. There was a message from my attorney. The disputed documents had been formally challenged. The bank had placed additional safeguards on the accounts. And there was one more update. The home equity application was being reviewed. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I understood that my revenge didn't have to be dramatic. It didn't have to involve destroying anyone. I simply had to stop carrying consequences that belonged to other people. Over the next several days, more truths came out. David admitted that his business had been struggling for almost a year. He had borrowed from our savings. Then he borrowed against the house. When that wasn't enough, he started moving money through different accounts. He told himself he would fix everything after the next big contract, then after the next one, then after another. It was always tomorrow. Until tomorrow finally arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Megan called me one evening. I'm sorry, she said. I sat quietly on my bed. For what? For letting David make you feel like you owed us something. I closed my eyes. Thank you for saying that. She cried. I didn't know everything. I know, but I knew enough. That sentence mattered. Because responsibility doesn't always begin with knowing everything. Sometimes it begins with admitting you knew enough to ask questions. A week later, David sent me a message. Not an apology, not a demand, just 3 words. I understand now. I didn't respond, not yet. Because understanding was easy. Change was harder. And I had spent too many years accepting promises when what I really needed was proof. For the next few weeks, I learned something I had never understood about leaving a broken relationship. The hardest part wasn't walking away. It was resisting the temptation to run back simply because the other person finally became sorry. David had spent years making me believe that his problems were mine to solve. Now that I had stopped solving them, he suddenly seemed to understand how serious everything was. But understanding consequences wasn't the same as changing. I stayed in the hotel for 4 nights. Then I moved into a small furnished apartment near my office. It wasn't beautiful. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people. The bedroom window faced a brick building. The couch had a tiny stain on one cushion that probably hadn't been there when it was new. But when I turned the key in the door that first evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. It was quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of a house where people were angry with each other. Real quiet. The kind where you could hear your own thoughts. I put my suitcase down and sat on the floor. For the first time in 11 years, nobody was waiting for me to cook dinner. Nobody was asking where their shirt was. Nobody was complaining about a bill. Nobody needed anything. And strangely, I didn't know what to do with myself, so I made spaghetti. Just spaghetti. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter and laughed at how ordinary it felt. Then I started crying, not because I was unhappy, because I was beginning to understand how tired I had been. The legal process moved slowly. There were calls with the bank, meetings with my attorney, documents to review, questions I never thought I would have to answer about my own marriage. I kept every piece of paperwork, every email, every statement, every message from David. My attorney reminded me repeatedly not to make emotional decisions while the financial issues were being sorted out. I appreciated that, because David was trying very hard to convince me that everything could go back to normal. One evening he sent me a long message. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He said the slap was the worst mistake of his life. He said he couldn't imagine losing me. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down. 6 months earlier, I would have answered immediately. I would have reassured him. I would have said we could fix everything. Instead, I waited. The next thing, another message arrived. I'll do anything. That sentence sounded familiar. People often say they'll do anything when they realize they're about to lose something. What matters is what they actually do afterward. David eventually started counseling. Then he enrolled in an anger management program. He also met with an accountant to untangle the business finances. I didn't ask him to do those things. That mattered to me. If I had to force him to change, then he wasn't changing. He was performing. His business suffered. Several clients stopped working with him after financial problems became public. He had to sell the newer truck he had bought while telling me we couldn't afford basic household expenses. He downsized his office. He stopped borrowing money from family. For the first time, David had to live within his means. His mother also stopped calling me for money. That was one of the strangest parts. For years, Linda had called me whenever something went wrong. Now there was silence. Then one Sunday afternoon she called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Hello, Rachel. Yes. She took a long breath. I want to apologize. I didn't say anything. I should have protected you. That surprised me, she continued. I knew David was taking money from the household account. I closed my eyes. How much did you know? Not everything. But enough, yes. Her voice cracked. Enough. I looked out the window. I appreciate you admitting it. I was afraid. I understand being afraid. She began crying. But fear doesn't excuse what I did. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. No, it doesn't. That was all I needed from her. Not excuses. Not a dramatic reconciliation. Just accountability. A few days later, David asked if we could meet. I agreed to coffee, public place, daytime. My choice. When he walked in, he looked different. Not dramatically. He had lost weight. His hair was messier. There was no expensive watch on his wrist. No confident smile. He sat across from me. Thank you for coming. I nodded. How are you? I'm okay. He looked down. I don't expect you to forgive me. Good. He gave a small, sad smile. I deserve that. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said I was angry at the wrong person. I waited. I was embarrassed about my business. I felt like a failure. And instead of admitting it, I made you responsible for fixing it. I looked at him. That was your choice. I know. And hitting me was your choice too. He swallowed. I know. He didn't make excuses. That mattered. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. I started selling things. What things I bought while telling you we were broke. I almost smiled. That must have been uncomfortable. It was. Good. He nodded. I deserve that too. We sat quietly. Then he reached into his jacket. I immediately became cautious. What's that? He placed a small envelope on the table. Don't open it now. I stared at him. What is it? The first payment. I didn't touch it. Payment for what I owe you. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. How much? $10,000. I shook my head. You don't have to give me cash at a coffee shop. I know. He looked embarrassed. I just wanted you to see that I'm actually doing something. I didn't take the envelope. Send it through my attorney. He nodded. Okay. That moment was important, because the old David would have argued. The old David would have said I didn't trust him. The new David simply said, okay, and that was when I realized something. Maybe reconciliation wasn't about returning to the way things were. Maybe it was about creating something entirely different. Trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. Forgiveness couldn't erase the past. It could only decide what I wanted to do with it. A month later, my attorney confirmed that the first repayment had arrived. Then another. David sold part of the business. He downsized his life. He continued counseling. He stopped asking me to rescue him. And slowly, very slowly, I began to believe that his actions might finally be telling the truth his words never had. I still didn't move back home. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. But I stopped seeing the future as a door that had slammed shut. It was a door I could choose to open someday, or leave closed. For the first time, the choice belonged entirely to me, and that was worth more than any revenge I could have imagined. 3 months after that dinner, I still hadn't moved back into the house. David and I were not husband and wife in the way we had once been. We were two people standing carefully on opposite sides of a bridge, trying to decide whether it was safe to cross. The legal problems were finally beginning to settle. The bank had completed its review of the disputed documents. My attorney had helped separate my finances from David's business obligations, and the home was no longer in immediate danger. There were still debts to resolve, still paperwork, still difficult conversations. But for the first time, the situation belonged to reality instead of secrecy. David had also changed his routine. He no longer expected me to fix things. He stopped calling when a business payment was late. He stopped asking me to cover expenses. He stopped telling me that everything would be fine if I would just trust him. Instead, he started doing something much harder. He told the truth, even when the truth made him look bad. His business had been failing for longer than he admitted. He had borrowed money because he was terrified of losing everything. Then once he started borrowing, he couldn't stop. Every new loan was supposed to solve the previous problem. Every lie was supposed to protect the next one. Eventually, the lies became larger than the business itself. He had told himself he was protecting his family, but he had actually been protecting his pride. That was something he finally admitted during one of our counseling sessions. I didn't expect to be there. At first, I had refused, but my counselor suggested that if reconciliation was ever going to be possible, we would eventually need a controlled environment where both of us could speak honestly. So I agreed to one session, just one. We sat several feet apart. This counselor asked David a simple question. Why did you hit her? David looked at the floor. I was angry. The counselor waited. He sighed. That isn't the whole answer. No. He rubbed his hands together. I wanted control. I looked at him. He continued. I felt like everything was falling apart. The business, the money, my reputation. And when Rachel came home late, I saw her as another person who wasn't doing what I needed. My stomach tightened. He looked at me. That wasn't fair. No, I said. It was abusive. I nodded. Yes. He didn't argue. He didn't say I had provoked him. He didn't say he was under pressure. He simply accepted the word. Abusive. That mattered. Because for years I had wondered whether I had somehow contributed to what happened. That day, I finally stopped carrying responsibility for someone else's violence. After the session, David asked if he could walk me to my car. I said yes. Outside, the afternoon was cold and bright. He stopped several feet away. I know I don't deserve another chance. I looked at him. You don't get to decide that alone. I know, but if you want one someday, you have to understand something. What I don't want the old marriage back. He nodded. The old marriage wasn't healthy. No, I looked toward the parking lot. I don't want promises. I don't want grand gestures. I don't want flowers every Friday. He gave a faint smile. Okay, I want honesty. I can do that. And respect. I know. And if you ever raise your hand to me again, there will be no conversation afterward. His face became serious. I understand. I believed that he understood. Whether he could live by it was something only time could prove. A few weeks later, David sold part of his contracting business. The money wasn't enough to solve everything, but it allowed him to make a substantial payment toward what he owed. He sent the money directly through the proper legal channels. No envelope, no dramatic presentation, no expectation that I would thank him. That was how I knew he was finally beginning to understand. The money wasn't a gift. It was responsibility. Around that same time, Linda asked if I would come to dinner. I almost said no. Then I realized I wasn't afraid of her anymore. So I went. She had made pot roast, the same kind she used to criticize me for making because, according to her, real wives don't need recipes. That evening, she placed a plate in front of me. Then she sat down. She looked uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology." I nodded. "You do?" She took a breath. "I treated you like you were responsible for keeping everyone comfortable." I looked at her. "You did. I thought because you were strong you could handle it." I smiled sadly. People say that when they don't want to admit they've been asking too much. She lowered her eyes. "I know." There was no dramatic forgiveness. No hug. No tears falling into each other's arms. Just honesty. And strangely, that felt better. Over time, Megan and Kyle also took responsibility for the money they had accepted. They began repaying what they could. Nobody blamed me. Nobody called me selfish. Nobody asked me to rescue them. The family had finally learned what I had been trying to teach them for years without ever saying it directly. Love does not mean unlimited access to another person's money, time, energy, or dignity. Months passed. David kept going to counseling. He stayed sober. He rebuilt his business slowly this time without borrowing from our household accounts. And he became more patient. Not perfect, but different. One Saturday afternoon he called. I finished the repairs on the back porch. I laughed. "You fixed something without asking me to pay for it, I know. It's a breakthrough." I smiled. It was the first time we'd joked together in months. Then he said, "Would you like to see the house?" I hesitated. "Maybe." So I went. When I opened the front door, everything looked familiar. The same hallway, the same living room, the same kitchen. But I was different. I walked into the dining room. The table was still there. The same table where David had ordered me to cook. The same table where I had placed those envelopes. The same table where our marriage had finally been forced to face the truth. David stood beside it. I almost got rid of this. Why too many memories? I touched the back of one chair. Maybe memories aren't always meant to be erased. He looked at me. What are they for? To remind us what not to repeat. He nodded. Then he asked the question I had been expecting for months. "Do you think we could try again?" I took a slow breath. "I don't know." He looked disappointed, but he didn't argue. I continued. "But I know I don't hate you." His eyes softened. "And I know I'm willing to see who you become." He nodded. "That's enough. We didn't kiss. We didn't promise forever. We simply stood there in the dining room. And for the first time, that room didn't feel like a place where I had been humiliated. It felt like a place where the truth had finally been spoken. A few weeks later, David asked me what I wanted for dinner. I looked at him and smiled. Something simple. Pizza perfect. He laughed. And I realized that maybe the most powerful ending wasn't watching someone suffer. It was reaching a point where their suffering was no longer necessary for me to feel whole. My revenge had never been about destroying David. It was about taking back the parts of myself I had surrendered. My voice, my confidence, my financial independence, my boundaries, and my understanding of what love should look like. If you are listening to this story and something in it feels familiar, remember this. You do not have to wait for a crisis to learn what is happening with your own finances. Know what accounts exist in your name. Read documents before signing them. Keep copies of important records, and never mistake patience for permission to be mistreated. Forgiveness can be powerful, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Reconciliation can be beautiful, but reconciliation should be built on accountability, safety, and consistent change. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming strong enough to say, "This ends with me." If this story touched something in you, take a moment to reflect on the people in your life who deserve your love and the boundaries that deserve your protection. If you believe someone else might need to hear that message, today share this story with them. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, dignity, second chances, and finding strength after betrayal, consider subscribing. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a slammed door or a dramatic victory. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with the courage to choose yourself.